Now, if you've lived in Richmond for any given amount of time, you probably know that invasive species like English ivy, winter creeper, and Bradford pear have been squashing our green spaces, and they've been doing that for years, which also squashes biodiversity, especially in the James River areas where there's a lot of it, or supposed to be a lot of it. Since invasive plants are an essential part of the food chain that have evolved with our wildlife have evolved to like consume these plants. And by consuming these plants, they've basically just kept their populations in check. But since non-natives are usually unsavory to wildlife because they're foreign, there's nothing keeping their populations in check. Not only are they probably already a lot of species predisposed to growing very quickly, but there's nothing stopping their growth unless you and I are going to get on our hands and knees and start ripping up the English ivy leaf by leaf or root by root. So they outcompete native species, and that can have a dramatic cascading effect on our native ecosystem and on our native ecosystems. And one of the biggest issues in Richmond is that there's not adequate funding for the James River Park system to combat this. And I'm not saying that's the city's fault. We're in the middle of a lot of different high priority issues, one of them being affordable housing. So it's hard to convince the city to allocate that much resources to an issue that isn't quite as life or death for a lot of, well, I won't say life. Yeah, life or death for a lot of Richmonders. But regardless, it needs to be confronted. And so how the city of Richmond has been doing that, well, I guess it's easier to say Richmonders have been doing that, is through volunteer groups that have stepped in and tackled the issue of invasive plant species from the grassroots up. So one of these individual volunteers is Anne Wright, who I was able to speak to back in March. She's a member of the Invasive Plant Task Force, one of the founding members. I think they've been operating since 2015. But this is our park site, and at first glance, it's kind of drab. It's easy to miss. It's notably kind of barren, I guess. There's not a whole lot of green going on, and that's usually we equate green with good, or green with a healthy, thriving ecosystem. And there's not much here. But basically, only a few years ago, this area was completely overtaken with English ivy. Here is a photo for reference. And this is, by the way, this is the land literally right across the street from Anne Wright. So you can see exactly where her work started and where it ended, or where I guess it hasn't started yet. Because what they do in the Invasive Plant Task Force is basically members are assigned a plot of land across the James River Park system. This is Anne's on the Buttermilk Trail. And they are basically in charge of organizing efforts to combat the invasion of non-native plants. So in Anne Wright's case, since it was mostly English ivy and winter creeper, she's had to organize a lot of manual plant removals. And thankfully, now it's a blank slate, which is great. But in other areas, I guess the situation looks a little different, which requires different methods to combat it. But even without any sort of city funding, its members and its members' dedication and advocacy efforts kind of paved the way for a more formalized response to invasive plant management, which is the Invasive Species Management Team, which is a smaller team within the broader Friends of the James River Park System organization. A lot of words, so I'm just going to call them the Friends organization from here on out. So Catherine McGuigan, I think that's how I say her name. Catherine, who is the program coordinator for this management team, basically said that the only reason their team exists is because of the Invasive Plant Task Force efforts. So while the task force pretty much remains independent from any sort of other larger organizations, a big part of what they do today is kind of serve as an advisory council to groups like the Invasive Species Management Team. which has one of the great parts about having an organized, like actually paid team of staffers on this is they've got a higher capacity for volunteer outreach. And I think right now they're actually developing a program that trains individuals to kind of practice invasive plant management individually in the park system. So I haven't gotten much word on that in a while, but I do know it's in the works. And one of the most promising strides taken here recently in the realm of invasive plant management in Richmond is the creation of a natural resource management plan, which outlines kind of a more coordinated, data-driven response to non-native invasions. And the plan was funded by Friends of the James River Park System, the Friends organization, and developed with guidance from scientific experts, city staff, and community partners like the task force. And a huge part of what it does also is formalize collaboration between city-funded park systems and local environmental groups like Friends, like the task force, but mostly Friends and the ISM team. So while the ISM team currently does end up working alongside city park staff and deputies pretty frequently to follow this plan, there is not an official resolution from the city for the park system to officially adopt it. So it's kind of just people, boots on the ground saying, oh yeah, this sounds good. Let's, I guess we can work together. It's not very formal at all. And McGuigan from the ISM team said that it was a really weird position for her team to occupy right now. Kind of like operating as a unit of the park system without being city employees and being funded by the Friends organization, but mostly working entirely independently from them. Yeah, she said that they just don't feel like they have a good home anywhere. And if all that sounds complicated, it's because it is really complicated. And so I'm gonna try to break it down the best way that I know how. Pretty much the best way I know to describe this. So you have the James River Park System, which is owned and funded by the city. They are independent. Then you have Friends of the James River Parks, which is a nonprofit. They are community funded. They operate based on donations and a lot of passion. So the Invasive Plant Task Force was actually founded completely independently from both of these two. It was just a bunch of community members that basically got fed up with all the invasive plants they saw everywhere and used their expertise to try to do something about it. And it worked. They generated a lot of buzz. Eventually, they kind of created a partnership with Friends of the James River Park, but they're still considered an independent organization. This is kind of their foster home, I guess. And then we have the ISM team, which is funded by Friends of the James River Park. So these are part of their employees. Invasive Plant Task Force, they're not funded at all. They're doing it for the love of the game. Invasive Plant Management Team, they are getting funded. So they've used and worked alongside the Invasive Plant Task Force to kind of figure out the direction that they want to go and put some more structure into how they're handling invasive plants in Richmond. And then over here, you also got them working loosely with the James River Park System. So not a partnership on paper, but they do end up working side by side a lot. And it took both of them, all three of these to come up with the Natural Resource Management Plan. And part of the Natural Resource Management Plan that the ISM team, honestly, everybody wants to see implemented into the city is a formalized partnership between specifically these two so that everybody can work in tandem and get more things done. So a handful of bills did pass the General Assembly this session in Virginia that do target invasive plants. First of all, we have House Bill 109, which basically eliminates commercial viability loopholes that previously prevented certain invasive species from getting on Virginia's noxious weed list because they were commercially viable, because they made people money. That bill basically just cut out that loophole. So hopefully we'll see more of these profitable invasive plants be barred from being bought and purchased in Virginia. We also have Senate Bill 89 and its twin, which is House Bill 388, which basically expands the powers of public service to include invasive plant control. So this it's kind of hard to explain, and it was kind of hard for me to understand, but basically it puts a lot more power into hands of like individual towns and communities in controlling their invasive plant problem, so they don't have to go to the state for help. Well, you probably don't know. I don't really know, but that's good. House Bill 88, it allows the management of roadside invasive plants in VDOT, the Virginia Department of Transportation. So that one's a little bit tricky and a little bit, I don't want to say vague, because there's a lot, that has to go into drafting and passing a bill. But yeah, it's really just saying that VDOT can't plant invasive species along roadways that they control. So as far as the management of plants, that is TBD. I don't know if VDOT's going to do a whole lot to actually combat the ones that are already there. That's pretty unlikely, but it's great that we can't plant them anymore. And lastly is Senate Bill 163, which allows volunteers to assist with invasive plant control on state-owned lands through supervised use of controlled herbicides. So I guess it's casting the net out a little bit further. Like if I want to go out to Pocahontas State Park and I okay it with them and make sure somebody's kind of over my shoulder, I can use some of these controlled herbicides to murk invasive plants. So most of these bills, which are set to go into effect on July 1st of this year, 2026, they mainly aim to kind of prevent further introduction and proliferation of these invasive species, but there are also a lot of limitations. So I spoke to Laura Greenleaf, who was one of the founders of the Invasive Species Task Force, and she basically explained to me, like, yeah, it's great that VDOT can't plant more invasives in our state roadways, but they're already choked, So on paper, I mean, don't get me wrong, on paper, the legislation is definitely a win, along with other budget increases for certain state natural resource agencies that dabble in invasive management. But even on the state level, Greenleaf told me that in order to directly manage the issue, there would have to be a colossal investment in resources from the state. So it's definitely progress, but it's incremental progress. Greenleaf said that it would have to be an all hands on deck, like federal, state, regional, and local type of confrontation of the issue in order for it to be effective. And so she described the current state of invasive management in Richmond as transitional. Community members have definitely stepped up to the plate in a ton of ways to volunteer and fundraise and just spread general awareness about the issue. And it's absolutely made a difference. But in order to actually solve the problem, Greenleaf told me that nonprofits basically just can't continue to bear the weight of the issue on their own. Stewardship would have to happen at the city level. But that being said, she also acknowledged the limitations for how much the city can actually contribute to this issue right now when we're in the middle of an affordable housing crisis. We've got issues in our schools and issues in the realm of public safety. So those things, they've got to be at the top of the list, Like, I'm absolutely environmental advocate myself, but I understand. So for now, the direct management of invasive species will continue to fall mostly to volunteers and very importantly, homeowners.
I love gardening. I've always loved gardening. I've been gardening for over 15 years, even since like my first tiny little apartment in the fan where I had like a like 10 by 10 foot little space
Yeah.
of city dirt and just enjoyed anything that was helpful for butterflies and caterpillars and bees and stuff like that. Funny enough, I was introduced to native plants very early on to gardening because I was struggling with a lot of the non-native plants that I had planted in my landscape. Like a lot of things, because I kind of envisioned having like a nice like European style garden or something like
Mhm.
that. But like a lot of the really commonly cultivated plants were just struggling in my garden and in my landscape because the soil was like heavy clay and it was a lot of shade. And the East Coast has a really high rainfall, annual rainfall compared to other parts of the world. And a lot of those commonly cultivated non-native plants prefer maybe more like Mediterranean habitats, or they don't like our slow draining clay soils. Um, and then at one point, I was just noticing that the native plants were growing really well compared to everything else. And furthermore, they were attracting and supporting a lot of wildlife. So slowly but surely, I replaced most of the exotic species in my gardens with Virginia or East Coast natives.
That's Henry Winfield, and he's the owner of a native plant nursery here in Richmond called Woolly Bear Natives, where basically he and his partner cultivate and experiment with different local species to figure out which ones can, there's a fuzzy, which ones can fill the role of popular non natives in people's landscapes.
Really just enjoy engaging people and learning more about native plants and our ecosystems and kind of seeing and experimenting with plants to see, there's a lot of because there's a lot of really cool native plants that aren't in cultivation, mostly just because like the landscaping industry mostly focuses on things that make money
Yeah.
and things that might be easier to cultivate or might be easier to sell because they're attractive, but might not necessarily be things that are the best for a landscape or things that are best for like local wildlife.
So, the nursery trade is almost fully responsible for the introduction of some of the worst invasive plants that are taking over wild spaces all across the US. Like English ivy was brought by settlers nearly 3 centuries ago, and today it is still marketed as a low maintenance, shade tolerant ground cover. And then you have winter creeper, which is a fan least favorite of many members of the task force and invasive species management team because of how difficult it is to remove, was also introduced as an evergreen ornamental. And now both of them run rampart across our wooded area. Is it rampart or rampant? Rampant. I think it's rampant. I'm a journalism major. I should know this. Um, Regardless, now they are absolutely overtaking trees, saplings, and just squashing other natives that used to scatter the forest floors around here. And then there is the infamous Callery pear or the Bradford pear, which you probably know for its very brief white blossoms, like 2 weeks out of the year, and also its offensive odor. It was initially marketed as a sterile tree, meaning that it wouldn't produce more trees. And that's a common defense for selling non natives, you know? But they started cross pollinating with other pear species, and it quickly turned into an infiltration of the East. But by the time these plants are identifiable problems, they're already sold and sought after, which makes them historically more difficult to ban or restrict their sales, which is exactly what House Bill 109 addresses.
Thankfully, there is a promising increase in movement in the last few years to label and ban sale of invasives,
Yeah.
including in Virginia. And there's a rising demand to make native plants more commonly available to retailers and gardeners.
So, between the recent legislation and the growing grassroots movements, there is reason for cautious optimism about the future of invasive plant management, specifically in Richmond. Winfield said that the solution starts with awareness, which is something that he strives to spread by teaching customers about the importance of biodiversity and planting natives. And for homeowners confronting the often overwhelming task of removal, he recommends doing it at your own pace and budget.
Like a garden is really a work cultivated in time. You don't need to do everything all at once. And I would say the same to those faced with having to remove invasive plants in their landscapes. Don't be discouraged by the work. Any amount you do is progress, even if it's just learning more about invasive plants.
Well, thank you for watching. This is the first time I've ever tried to produce content like this, or really like content in general. And I'm definitely a little bit out of my comfort zone, but it only gets easier from here. Um, but yeah, I'll see you guys next time for another semi deep dive on another maybe obscure topic. So, um, enjoy the rest of your day. See you later.